Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series on global sustainability, Insight from IPCC AR6 Authors. Along with the launch of the 3 IPCC Climate Report, Early Career Researchers Working Group at Future Earth Taipei, together with the Center for Sustainability Science in Academia Sinica, invites lead authors from the 6th assessment report to share their insight on cutting-edge climate issues. For our new audience, Future Earth Taipei is an international organization based on Academia Sinica to promote sustainability science in Taiwan and the Asia Pacific. I'm the session chair today. My name is Wanyu Shi. I'm the Associate Professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Disaster Management of Minchuan University. Our guest today is Dr. Chandni Singh, Senior Researcher at the India Institute for Human Settlement at Bengaluru. She has research interests in changing livelihood in rural and urban areas. Dr. Singh has been the lead author and contributing author of several UN reports, including IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, and Global Assessment Report on Drought, and the latest IPCC Climate Change Report on Impact, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. She has led 2 chapters. One is the Asia chapter, and another one is the cross chapter paper on cities and settlement by the sea. Today, Dr. Singh will give us a talk on assessing the feasibility and effectiveness of adaptation. This is one of the key messages from this report. So I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Chandni Singh, to give this quite important talk to our audience. Now, the microphone is yours, Dr. Singh. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this invitation, and I'm very happy to speak to a regional audience on this report. I've been doing a lot of other interviews and just talks about this, but this one is particularly special also because I know there'll be lots of early career researchers listening in. So thank you so much for the invitation. I have a set of slides. I'll go over them, which are basically about the key findings from this IPCC report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. I'll also be focusing a bit on the Asia chapter in particular and what we are finding, and very happy to take questions later on any of these things. So yes, thanks, Dolly. So just to give an idea to people who aren't familiar with the IPCC, first of all, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which means that it really is the scientific body of the United Nations which works on climate change. This particular report was Working Group 2, where we focus on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So how is really climate change affecting human beings as well as natural systems? We had a large group of 270 authors from 67 countries. And for particular expertise that we didn't have, we brought in another 675 contributing authors. So it's a very large team of people working. And you can imagine it was particularly difficult because we were working during the pandemic, so we couldn't meet at all and had to work online. I just wanted to highlight one more thing in this slide, that throughout the writing of the report, which took around 4 to 5 years, we regularly get comments from the scientific community as well as by governments. And that's the number that you see at the bottom, 62,500 review comments. And as authors, we have to go through each comment and respond to them. And they're all available publicly. So we have to either say that we've accepted the comment and made a change, or we've rejected them. Also, just to add on the slide that this report is really assessing and synthesizing the large literature that is there on adaptation. More than 34,000 scientific papers were assessed for this. And so it just shows you that a lot of effort went into this, and also that we know a lot more about climate adaptation and vulnerability now. So moving on to the next slide. I think this sentence in particular really summarizes the report very well. I'd like to read it out because I think it's really important. The first thing we say is that the scientific evidence is unequivocal. That means there's no doubt now in our minds that climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. So both human and natural systems are affected. The second thing is this idea of urgency, that any further delay in global action will miss the rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So this idea that the opportunities to adapt are reducing, so there's a small closing window of opportunity. However, the report also is very particular to highlight that there are already several solutions that exist, and I'll go into the details of those solutions later on. Next slide, please. So the first bit of this presentation is really going to focus on natural systems and the kinds of risks and impacts we are seeing in them. First of all, we know that already global warming has caused dangerous and widespread disruption in nature. This is through increased frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme events, both on land and in oceans. And there are very clear impacts that the report talks about in terms of impacts on ecosystems. Here I can give you an example from Asia. We are already observing biodiversity and habitat loss of certain animal and plant species. For example, I think in the Asia chapter, we talk about how in South Korea, there are certain oak species, so trees that are having to move upwards or migrate upwards to, just to survive, because temperatures at their current elevation are becoming too warm for these species. Another example, of course, is also around oceans and coral reefs being bleached by rising sea temperatures as well as by ocean acidification. Next slide. The other aspect, of course, is that while natural systems are being affected, climate change is also affecting the lives of billions of people in spite of our efforts to adapt. Not only are lives being affected, but also livelihoods. People, especially who are dependent on fisheries, on agriculture, so anything that relates directly to climate or is dependent on the climate directly. Some of the findings that we have that really have very strong lines of evidence are around the fact that human-induced climate change is going to lead to an intensification of tropical cyclones, increasing sea level rise, and very heavy rainfall events, or even very erratic rainfall events, which will result in increasing losses and damages. And we show that we are already seeing these losses and damages, and they will only increase as we go forward. Here again, I'd like to highlight that Asia as a region is across all these extreme events is considered the most exposed to sea level rise, water scarcity, flooding, etc. For example, in our Asia chapter, we show that agriculture across the region, and when I keep on saying Asia, in the IPCC, we had assessed 51 countries within Asia. So moving from West Asia to North Asia, which also included Russia, South Asia, which had India, the country I come from, and the whole Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and then East Asia, going up till Japan. So Asia actually covered 51 countries, which was also quite a task, as you can imagine, for all of us to read through this very vast literature. So coming back to the point on this slide that agriculture in particular is really being impacted and shown to be very vulnerable in Asia under increasing climate change because of both changing temperatures as well as changing precipitation or rainfall. Again, in India, for example, we already have clear projections that even at 1.5 degrees Celsius average warming, so globally, if temperatures go up to 1.5 degrees Celsius, rice production will see a 10% decrease, and that decrease will go up to 30% fall in our crop yields if we warm to 4 degrees Celsius. So that's just one example, but we have similar examples about different crops in the report. In Southeast Asia and Cambodia specifically, we also show that there's going to be reductions in rice production unless we really cut down emissions fast. Next slide. So if we move on, and I gave that example of agriculture, but of course, across different sectors, we see that impacts are going to be felt. One of the key things that we really talk about in a lot of detail, and which is newer, I think, in this report compared to earlier ones, is we focus a lot on cities as hotspots of risk. So we show very clearly that in cities, impacts are magnified. And this is particularly important to understand because half of the world's population is living in our cities. Some examples of risks in cities are extreme heat and heat waves. Also, the fact that critical infrastructure like transport, water, energy systems will also be hit by extreme events like a cyclone or a typhoon hitting coastal infrastructure. Again, we have a lot of very strong evidence from Asian cities where we show in our chapter that Asian cities are going to see very significant sea level rise, extreme heat and very hot days as well as nights. And then there are going to be ripple effects or second order impacts on health, on critical infrastructure, as well as people's livelihoods. Next slide. So these were some of the impacts, and so impacts are current, and then risks are the possibility of impacts increasing in the future. And one of the things, like one of the overall takeaways from the report around risks and impacts is really that when we look into the future, every small increase in warming will result in very high increases in risk to nature and to people, and in every region of the world. So let us consider now some of these projected risks. Next slide. So one of the big or very significant findings we have is that there's going to be a lot of biodiversity loss at higher degrees of warming. There's also, we show that as you move from 1.5 degrees to 3 degrees, there will be almost a 10-fold increase in biodiversity loss and risk of extinction of certain species as it warms from 1.5 to 3 degrees. Next slide. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of risks we can imagine to happen in the future. You can just click through these. There are 4 clicks you can do for this slide. Yeah. I mean, there's 4. Yeah, thanks so much. So on this really, so that was a bit like biodiversity loss again on the natural side. And then we have these kinds of risks that we expect on the human system side. So the first one is around heat stress, again, very relevant for Asia. We know globally that the population exposed due to heat waves will continue to increase with additional warming. For example, the city of Calcutta in India had seen a heat wave, a record heat wave in 2015. And these kinds of very high heat waves are only going to become an annual event if we hit 1.5 degrees of average global temperatures. Japanese and Chinese cities as well are expected to see much more frequent and longer heat waves by 2050 unless we reduce our emissions. And of course, it's important to understand while we talk of heat waves or these particular events, there are real world implications of those. So it will lead to heat related morbidity and mortality. So affect labor productivity and also have impacts on particular people. So not all people will be affected similarly when you think of extreme heat in a city. People who live near green spaces, for example, or people who are able to cool their homes, they will be able to deal with heat much better than say people who have to work outside during the hot parts of the day. The second bit on this slide really talks about how water security and water availability are going to be affected by global warming. We know with the data that at least in the Asian region, again, the Himalayan glaciers are already seeing a lot of glacial melt, and that will only increase at higher degrees of warming. This, of course, has downstream impacts both on how the rivers will flow and then how that river water is used for irrigation, and so it will also affect agriculture. Further, we know that with a lot of certainty again that climate change will be, unless we reduce our emissions, climate change will undermine food security, and at higher warming levels such as 2 degrees of warming by mid-century, which is 2050, we will see that people across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and South America are likely to experience food shortages with really critical impacts on malnutrition. In this regard, South and Southeast Asia within the Asian region are particularly exposed to negative impacts in agriculture. And then finally, this last part of the slide, which is around the fact that many people live in low-lying cities and other settlements along coasts, and they are going to be seeing higher levels of risk from sea level rise and other climate hazards like cyclones and storm surges and very, very high speed winds. Again, here I would like to add that the Asia numbers are particularly stark. So 12 of the top 20 countries that are exposed to sea level rise and associated flooding events are actually in Asia, with countries like China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Indonesia going to be seeing the most numbers of people exposed to these multiple hazards happening. Next slide. Now here I want to just highlight that I have been talking of particular risks and impacts and extreme events in isolation. But we know, and this report really strongly talks about this idea of compound risks. So this is the idea that when multiple extreme events happen at the same time, they compound the overall risk, or they add the overall risk, and they become much more difficult to manage than single risks. In this particular case, we see the example of how extreme heat and drought can combine to cause a reduction in crop yields, and that can reduce productivity of people just because of heat stress among people working on farms. And then, of course, reduced yields can also, like crop yields, when they go down, that can also affect household incomes. And that can then lead to, changes in food prices, and it can ripple out globally. So it's important to understand that multiple extreme events are going to happen simultaneously. And the other idea that I'd like you to take away from this slide is really that these impacts that are going to happen in a particular sector, for example, if it's agriculture, it will not only remain in that sector. So if there are food supply problems because of climate change, that will ripple out to even urban areas which depend on villages for food. So the cascading of risk can happen across locations, for example, rural to urban areas, also across sectors where, one sector is affected, the water sector, and then that impacts the agriculture sector. So it can ripple across sectors as well. And it's important to understand these things because our adaptation strategies have to be really focused on recognizing both compound risk as well as cascading risk. Next slide. So far I've been talking, one before, please. There should be, yeah, with those 2 circles. So I have been, next, it's fine, yeah. So I have been talking, of course, a lot about just the very negative implications of climate change and really where we are right now and where we are headed unless we do something. And these 2 circles, this figure really is the starting point of the Working Group 2 summary for policymakers. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it. What I want to say on the left side, you see a world which we are in currently, where we have climate change on top. And then you have, if you look to the bottom left, you see human society, where there are losses and damages taking place. On the right, you see ecosystems, including biodiversity, where there are limits to adaptation. Just the systems are completely collapsing. And so this is a space of high risk that we are in today. And then if you move to the right side, you see this figure where this is where we really want to go. This is where we want to, so we look at how human systems are transitioning in the second circle. We talk about this idea of ecosystems transitioning, and actually where you harness nature to sort of adapt to these very devastating risks that climate change poses. And then in the center of that circle, you see this idea of climate resilient development, where you want to move to a healthy human and natural systems. You want to move to a space where there is equity and justice and really planetary health, where both human and non-human species can live well. So it's really this is a framing figure which tries to say on the left side, this is where we are at, where climate change is causing impacts and risks. And we want to move to a future condition where we can say that we are following a pathway of climate resilient development. So now, given this framing, I'm going to really move on to what I think is the main set of messages I want to talk about today around adaptation. So next slide. So far, I've really been talking about the various challenges we're going to face because of climate change and how it's going to become only more and more difficult at higher warming levels. But what we really need to ask is, where are we going and how well are we adapting to this changing climate? What we know from this report is, first of all, that adaptation action has increased globally. There is a lot of evidence for that, but the progress has been quite uneven. And even where we are making progress, it's not fast enough. So it's not keeping pace with the kinds of impacts that we are seeing. We also know that there is growing public and political awareness on climate impacts, and this has resulted in at least 170 countries all over the world having adaptation plans in their climate policies and in their national documents, but they still remain in the planning stage and don't move towards, more implementation stages. So next slide. And this is the idea of the fact that there are increasing gaps between adaptation actions taken and what is needed. And these gaps in particular are largest among lower income populations and in developing countries. And this is of particular worry, I guess, especially in Asia, also because we do have very large populations that are still facing a lot of poverty, that have a lot of development needs. And so how do you sort of bridge this adaptation gap, particularly for low income populations? And so we see that at the current rate of planning and implementation, these adaptation gaps only will continue to grow. Next slide. Now here I'm going to switch a bit to talk about what we did. So we were trying to understand what the literature is saying on adaptation. And we realized that just the literature on adaptation has grown so much since the assessment report 5. And this is what I call like the big literature challenge in adaptation, where if you see overall climate change research has been doubling every 5 to 6 years, people have found. Compared to all other research, so usually scientific research obviously is increasing, we know that. And typically the normal range of growth of research is around 4% every year. But climate change research is growing at 16% every year. So just imagine the number of papers that one has to read and understand to synthesize evidence on climate change is growing a lot. Within that, adaptation research in particular is doubling, and in some cases even growing by 150% in the recent past. So I'm giving these numbers just to say that there is a big literature challenge in adaptation. It's not a problem of less, it's actually a problem of too much. You won't find this part in the IPCC report, but I'm just giving this for context really, and then I'll talk a bit about how do we deal with this challenge. So while we do have a lot of literature on climate change adaptation, as many of you might know, it's highly localized. So they're very case study specific evidence. So you'll have examples of one city or even one community, one particular village or a set of villages. And so it's very, very fragmented, this evidence base. The second thing is that because it's so fragmented, we are unable to really pull out key policy takeaways or broad ideas of what do we take away from all this case study based literature. And then finally for the IPCC really, so while we do a lot of assessment of the literature to say this is what it's saying, we are also very keen to identify knowledge gaps, because the climate change community, the research community reads these reports and sees if these knowledge gaps are pulled out, then we need to fill those gaps. So how do you recognize or identify knowledge gaps when you just have such a, fragmented large pool of studies? So researchers have used various ways to deal with this challenge. Some of them do rapid assessments. There are systematic literature reviews, expert elicitation, where you actually just get a group of experts and ask them which is the most important study and why you should focus on them. Next slide. So what we ended up doing is this idea of coming up with a framework to assess this very fragmented adaptation literature. And what we did, we assessed the feasibility of adaptation. This was a methodology that we had tested out in the special report on 1.5 degrees, which came out in 2018. And we continued to develop this methodology. So basically what we are saying, what is adaptation feasibility? It's this idea that what adaptation strategies or options are feasible or possible and which ones aren't. And it's basically to give decision makers, policy makers a tool to say that, these are the number of adaptation options that are available, which you can already implement. And so please go ahead and implement them. Like, we should not think that not having these kind of assessments by not doing these assessments, you should not have the excuse of not actually acting and implementing adaptation. So now, how do you define feasibility? If we say we want to do an assessment of feasibility, we have to have a working definition of it. And this is a big challenge for adaptation again, just because what is feasible in A place is going to be different from what is feasible in B place. So it's very context specific. This is unlike mitigation, where feasibility is considered as anything is feasible if it meets long-term climate targets, such as, you have these terms of net zero emissions by 2050 or reaching a 1.5 degree goal. So there's an end point in sight. So in the adaptation space, this is slightly different. We don't have as many feasibility studies. So we really wanted to get into this methodologically and then demonstrate it by doing a whole assessment. Next slide, we can go. We don't have to go into so much detail. All right, yeah, this is fine. So this is where I start. I know there's very little on the slide just now. It will fill up. So I am going to walk you through how we did this assessment, what does it mean, and then how you should read this figure that we have in the summary for policymakers, which is figure 4 of this report. So right now, what you see on your screen is really this idea of system transitions. Unlike typical assessments where we look at sectors, so water sector, agriculture sector, forestry, we actually thought of system transitions. So we keep on saying that we need to break out of the sectoral way of thinking. And so we fitted adaptation options or mapped adaptation options based on system transitions. So the first one is land and ecosystem transitions, anything to do with agriculture, forests, oceans. The second one is around cities, urban and infrastructure systems. The third is energy systems. And the fourth is cross-cutting things, cross-sectoral options that cut across all these other systems I spoke about. Next slide. Now, the second bit of the figure is representative key risks. This is the idea that when you have these different systems, there are certain parts of the system that are particularly at risk. For example, coastal systems are at risk, terrestrial systems, water insecurity, especially around food security is at risk. So this is how you go down, and the report captures 9 representative key risks, if I remember correctly. Next slide. Then moving on, here we have the set of adaptation options that we assess. So these adaptation options map onto those system transitions as well as these key risks. So to say that if you start in land and ecosystem system transitions, you have certain sectors that are at risk, certain parts of that system are at risk, and these are the various adaptation options you have to reduce that risk. Next slide. This is I just would like to also add that these adaptation options were chosen. This is not the full set of things you can do to adapt. These are just an illustrative set. And of course, different countries, different cities will have many more adaptation strategies. Now, this final bit of the figure is really doing the feasibility assessment. So on the column which has a tick over it, which says potential feasibility, this is an overall measure of feasibility. Some options are highly feasible. That means they are very feasible. Some of them are less feasible. And then you've got these blue bubbles, lots of them, right? Economic, technological, institutional, social, environmental, and geophysical. So there are these 6 categories or 6 dimensions of feasibility, and we gave a high, medium, or low score. So to say that if you have a very, very small dot, that means that there is a barrier there. That's why that adaptation option is not able to be feasible. We are not able to implement it. Very, very small dots. But if you have a big dot that says that, okay, these adaptation options don't have any barriers, and so you can implement them immediately. So this is a way for policymakers to say, all right, if you look at forest-based adaptation, it has a big dot in total, and it has a smallish dot in institutional feasibility. So, you know, there are some institutional barriers, and perhaps if I remove them, the feasibility will increase overall. I know this is quite complex, but what I just want you to take away is that, first of all, this is a way for policymakers to recognize that there are many different options that are already there for them to use. Secondly, some of these options have barriers, and that's where the small dots are, and they should really focus on reducing those barriers. Next slide. Now, this was only part of the figure because you realize suddenly one more column came in the middle, which is called Synergies with Mitigation. And this column really is to say that while some adaptation options, usually we put in adaptation options to reduce risk to climate change, but some of them can also help us meet mitigation outcomes. So agroforestry, if we look at that example in row 5, we'll see that it has a big bubble under mitigation, which shows that when you plant trees, agroforestry, for example, planting trees along farmland, you can also sequester carbon and reduce, you can capture carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there are some options which have strong synergies with mitigation, and they should be implemented because of these co-benefits. Next slide. And this actually is quite an innovative thing, I would say, just because we often keep adaptation in working group 2 and then focus on mitigation in working group 3. But this assessment brought those 2 things together to say we have to look at these things as coupled. Okay, so this is again the first panel of the figure, which we spoke about earlier. And then if you just click once more, you will see that there was a second part to this figure. Yeah, if you just click once more, I think it will be, yeah. So the second part of the figure, you can just click twice more on this slide. There are 2 things that come up. The first is where you see all these pluses and minuses in blue. They are the relationship with the various SDGs. So it's basically telling again, the policymaker, that when you have a particular adaptation strategy, you might have a positive impact on certain SDGs or a negative impact on certain SDGs. And in some places, we just don't have the evidence on whether there's a positive or a negative impact. So again, this particular panel is really talking to the policymaker, especially in countries that are still focusing on meeting the SDGs, to say you can adapt and meet your SDGs simultaneously. So it's like a double win or a co-benefit. And then this final bit in the middle is what says the columns that say observed relation with sectors and groups at risk. This particular set of pluses and minuses are telling us about the equity concerns or the outcomes of adaptation, that sometimes certain adaptation strategies can have positive outcomes for, no, if you just go ahead. Oh no, go back, sorry. Some adaptation options can have negative outcomes for particular ethnic groups or particular genders, and some adaptation options can have positive outcomes. So the idea of taking these two big panels of this very complex figure is to say, you have, first of all, you have adaptation strategies that are feasible. Second, some of them have mitigation benefits. Third, some of them can also help you deliver or meet your SDGs. And fourth, you need to keep equity considerations in mind when adapting. So it's really complex, I know, and it can feel a bit overwhelming to see all this evidence, but I hope I've been able to talk through how you can read this figure really. And just to add that these figures alone had around 1,400 references underlying them. So for each plus and minus that you see, we conducted very detailed assessments of the literature to, back up that plus and minus or dot, that is that kind of symbol that's there. Okay, so now we can move on. Yeah, I can just click through, actually, they're just two things. I just wanted to take you through two examples, basically one more click, two examples, one a rural agriculture related example, and then an urban example to really talk about feasibility and effectiveness. So you can just click through again to the next slide. So the first example is from agriculture. We assessed various things you can do in agriculture to adapt to climate change. For example, you can change your irrigation patterns, like bringing in drip and sprinkler irrigation. You can have rainwater storage and water saving technologies, and then things like soil moisture conservation. And what we find overall that technologically, so we already have the techniques and tools to do all these things. But there are a lot of institutional barriers that remain. Like, do we have adequate subsidies for very poor farmers to be able to take up some of these strategies? So that's where there are some gaps. And that's what that feasibility assessment allows you to do. It finds the barriers. The second thing that we saw is that actually changing irrigation practices and adapting through irrigation can have a lot of both economic and ecological benefits. And they also meet multiple sustainable development goals, whether related to water, related to incomes, and the SDG 14, I think, which is life on land. Finally, irrigation options can also have strong synergies for mitigation, but also a lot of trade-offs. So depending on what fuel you use to irrigate your crops, there can be negative impacts for mitigation. Next slide. These are just examples from that large table. Yeah. The second example is this idea from cities. Cities in particular just get a lot of mention in this report because we know that urban areas are going to be housing or be home to 2/3 of the world's population by 2050. So we know that most of the challenges and opportunities for adaptation are really in cities. And what we show is that there are several options that cities are already implementing. So we have a lot of nature-based adaptation options, such as planting trees, urban agriculture, and we also have infrastructural adaptation options, such as having seawalls or building dams to protect from flooding. Several other approaches are there, like sustainable land use planning, having proper building codes, and then also having early warning systems to give climate forecasts, cyclone forecasts. So across cities, we see that there are many highly feasible adaptation options. It's very possible to do them. Many cities are already implementing them. But again, there are some institutional barriers and there are some socio-cultural barriers. So just people don't accept certain things. There are many examples of these where maybe because of a particular cultural context, a particular idea or perception of a certain strategy, they may not be acceptable socio-culturally. Also, just finally to add, I think there are a lot of co-benefits of urban adaptation, both for human health, for human, all the sustainable development goals, many of them such as SDG 10 and SDG 11, that's a typo there, obviously. Yeah, and we can move on. I'm nearly ending now, just because I realize, yeah, I just wanted to, this is a point that I think is quite novel in this particular report, which is around maladaptation. So while maladaptation has been discussed even in the assessment report 5, it finds a lot of discussion in AR6 because we have a lot of evidence now of maladaptation. And maladaptation is really just the unintended negative consequences of adaptation. And what we show, for example, on the left side, this classic example of maladaptation where building seawalls, for example, to keep coastal floods out can have negative impacts either on particular people or even particular ecosystems where, just building these structures can change the ecology of the place. And maladaptive seawalls can also be maladaptive sometimes because they cause what we call a moral hazard. They make people feel safe because of their presence, and people then choose to remain in places that are very risky rather than moving away from them. Next slide. Of course, the report also highlights this facet of adaptation limits to say that even if we adapt in very effective ways, we are going to see losses and damages. And especially above 1.5 degrees, we are going to see that certain natural solutions, nature-based solutions, are not going to be effective. So that's a limit that we're already hitting. And then at higher warming levels, like 2 degrees Celsius, it'll be very challenging for other kinds of things. So there will be other limits that we reach, such as, being able to farm multiple staple crops in areas where we currently grow them. And so there is this idea of both hard limits beyond which we can't adapt and soft limits where we have a little more time, a little more leeway to adapt. Next. And so the report really moves towards from the story of risk and impact that I told you to this idea of adaptation feasibility and how effective they are, and maybe even some maladaptive consequences, to this idea of now, how do we continue to move and nudge ourselves towards a positive future? And it really lands on this note of we need urgent action to adapt to climate change, but that alone is not enough. And we definitely at the same time need to make rapid deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions so that we can allow ourselves the space to continue to adapt. Next. What this means is, you can click again. What this means is that we land in this idea of climate resilient development, and that is what the report closes with. What does climate resilient development mean? First, that we need to reduce our climate risks, what we've been talking about, adaptation. Second, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is mitigation. We need to enhance our biodiversity and just our ecosystems and their health. And then finally, to achieve our SDGs. And all of this has to come together to lead to climate resilient development. Next slide. That's my last one. You can just click through one more. So this, and one more. This idea of climate resilient development, and this is the last figure in the summary for policymakers, it really, if you look at it from left to right, it says that already some countries and some places have had past emissions, they have seen past climate change and have developed in a certain way. Then the blue dot is where the present situation is. This is where we are today, 2022. And now is our moment where we have a choice to take. We can either move upwards towards the green side, where we meet all our SDGs. You see that little wheel of all the SDGs being met, and we can move towards a future that is green. So if you look on the right-hand side, right on top, where you reach well-being, human well-being, low poverty, ecosystem health, risks are low. So it's a future that is good and that is considered to be climate resilient development. However, if you look on the bottom side, if we are going to follow these red and pink paths, our SDGs will fall apart. And then we will reach a place where we will have high vulnerability, high poverty, high risk, and rising emissions. So it's really this moment in time where as a species, we need to take these decisions of rapid greenhouse gas emission cuts. We need to take decisions of adapting aggressively, as well as making sure that we are not leaving behind the most vulnerable and most poor in our countries and in our communities behind. And so this is where the IPCC report ends, at this idea or vision of climate resilient development towards the top right side. And that's where I'd like to end. My last slide just has my details, where if anyone wants to get in touch, they can. Thank you so much. I know it's a lot, so thank you for being so patient.
No, thank you very much for this very important talk from this IPCC AR6 Impact, Adaptation, Vulnerability. And I think there are already a lot of questions with our audience. I'd like to invite everyone to join the question and answer sections. So we can take your questions from the chat box or in person. If you like to raise a question, please use the button icon next to the face here. Here is the raise hand functions, so you can raise your hand. Or alternatively, you can put your question in the chat box. I think our participants today is quite international. I can see several people from foreign country. Right. Generally, okay, I already see one hand here. I think this is our old friend from Scotland. It's Dr. Leslie Mabon. Please turn on your microphone and questions.
Andy, thanks very much for a really super presentation, and congratulations on being part of a team that have produced such an important piece of research. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the role of qualitative research in Working Group 2. And I know what's been very distinctive about this report is that there has been a lot of qualitative research that's been included. So I was just wondering if you could share a bit more about how, as a working group, you, I guess, maybe assess the quality of qualitative research and how you consider that in relation to quantitative and numerical research, and how you use that to synthesize insights.
Do you want me to take questions one by one? Is that?
I think, right. Yeah, I think we can take questions one by one. So,
yeah, thanks so much, Leslie. I think that was a great question, because I'm myself a qualitative researcher and often struggle in the way the IPCC functions, at least earlier the way it functioned. And as you rightly say, I think this time around we just had such a rich, marvelous group of amazing qualitative researchers. So critical geographers, development studies experts. We had a philosopher in chapter 18. So really pushing the boundaries of a typical IPCC report. Of course, as you would have seen, and I'm sure you know that when you read IPCC reports, you have these two ways of really signaling to a reader the kind of evidence we have. So one is this idea of confidence language, where we say medium confidence or high confidence. And that typically is made up of two other assessments that we do, which is that, is there a lot of literature? So is there a lot, the quantity, and then is that agreeing with each other or not, right? And that kind of assessment of the literature lends itself, I mean, the quantitative literature lends itself well to that kind of assessment. And it's more difficult in qualitative research because we keep on saying, yes, we are confident, but there are all these qualifiers. And that's what qualitative research does very well. So it is a struggle, but I think the way we did it, and there were a couple of early innovations I think we did. One was this group of researchers within and outside the IPCC who set up what is called GAMI, or the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, where we, and maybe you were part of it, I'm not sure, because it was such a big group of people, more than 200 researchers, early career and otherwise, who assessed both quantitative and qualitative adaptation studies really, and pulled together that information to say that from case-based, very qualitative work as well as quantitative work, this is what we are seeing in terms of adaptation effectiveness. This is what we are seeing in terms of the governance of adaptation. So there were various streams of work we did within that GAMI initiative, I think. Also to add, I think because of the large enough pool of qualitative researchers in this round, we were able to push back against some of the calls for quantification. So we just said that the numbers can't adequately capture the complexity of, say, adaptation implementation, like political will, the lack of political will. You can't quantify that really, but we have so many studies that talk about it. So please don't push us towards quantification where it's a bad fit. And I think when you have a critical mass of authors who think that like that, you are able to bring those findings up. And another example to me, which was a big win, I think, for the critical geographer group in the author pool was this inclusion of colonialism in the summary for policymakers, which we know from decades of research that certain countries aren't able to adapt just because of their histories. And just how resources have been extracted by certain countries, how because of that education systems are set up in certain countries. And we know this, there's a lot of qualitative evidence, but you aren't able to put a number to that. Like how much is the adaptation gap in a colonized country versus a non-colonized country? But we were able to bring it in because we said just the number of papers on this is far, I mean, there is no question around this anymore. So how can we not put a high confidence statement? So I think these are just examples of constantly explaining and trying to push that, just the pushback on qualitative research. Yeah. But I think we did quite well as well. This time it's not been such a difficult thing. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very interesting and important question because basically this report is trying to connect the science and policy making. So this is really important. And I can see another two questions from the same person. I think that is from Chen Hongying. Would you like to just use microphone to ask your question?
Hello, Johnny and everyone. Thank you for your presentation. There are two questions. So the first is that I wonder if there are any kind of further guidance or documents that can elaborate on the action plan for the pathway concerning different countries or regions across different contexts. That's the first one. And the second one is that because IPCC is also kind of similar to many other like this kind of global summits or processes that there's always this concern about effective kind of monitoring or supervision kind of element or mechanism. So I wonder how the IPCC processes are adjusting these critical parts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think these are really, really critical questions you ask. So the first one on guidance documents on pathways for particular countries or regions, I wouldn't say they are explicit documents as such, but if you look at the 3 synthesis chapters of this report, chapter 16, 17, and 18, which are the last 3 chapters of the working group 2, you will get a fairly good sense of at a global and regional level, all the story I told you, which is on risks and impacts, then moving into how do you make decisions to adapt, and then actually moving into climate resilient development, where they talk a bit about pathways. But of course, and I'm sure you know this, we don't have the kinds of pathways that you see in a working group 3 report, you know, the mitigation pathways where different countries or different regions are along different trajectories. We just don't have that equivalent, I guess, in adaptation. So there is a gap there. And as I said, it's just because of the nature of adaptation research, because we don't know our end goal in sight. Like we don't know, we don't have an adaptation goal, explicit adaptation goal. Of course, it is this idea of reducing risk, but risk of whom, how many people's risk, you know, those kind of specifics are just not there. And so when you need to build pathways, you need to know what you're building it towards, that future, that end point in sight. And that's why we have a more qualitative pathway, which is this idea of climate resilient development pathways. So I'd really ask you to look at chapter 18 in that regard. Coming to your second question, I think, again, this is a concern. There are various bodies, I think, that do assessments of various kinds. The IPCC, of course, on climate change, but then we have IPBES on biodiversity and ecology. We have, of course, the UN DRR system, so the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction System, which does similar assessments called on risk and disaster risk, called the Global Assessment Reports or GAR reports. So there are so many of these parallel things. Of course, they have specific tasks, but there are overlaps as well. And I feel we don't do quite well in having discussions between these kind of processes and also building, if not global ways to come together. I can imagine the Asia sections of IPCC, IPBES, and GAR reports to come together and say something on Asia as a whole. And I don't think that's happening. So coming back to your question, I'm also curious as if we are getting to those things together. I don't think at this moment we are. But just to also highlight, at least in the Asia chapter, we do talk of increasing evidence of collaboration between countries. So it might not be happening at a global scale, but especially in particular parts of South Asia, there is a lot of knowledge sharing and data sharing happening to some extent. And in our chapter 10 on Asia, you'll see some examples of that given. Yeah. Thank you for your questions.
Okay, and we have another 2 questions coming out. First one is from Zhongyuan University. I think this is a Indonesia student, Gansar Satrio. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you for the explanation. I have questions. In the developing country, most of the time, the government are sacrificing the environmental conditions for short-term economic growth. As we know that in a democratic country, for a re-election, most of the time they promise an economic growth which is tangible for the mass, but this sacrifice the environmental conditions of said place. What do you think could be done to balance this problem? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gangsar. I think this is at the heart of the problem, right? We all know this. This is the story of my country as well. Every election, there'll be politicians promising a lot of things. And then we know once they're elected, they're putting in projects and things that are actually leading to environmental degradation. So I completely agree. What we show now in this report very, very clearly is that it is not an either or situation. You can't think of development without the environment, and you can't think of the environment without meeting some human development or sustainable development goals. And that is what I think this idea of climate resilient development, that if you want to meet human needs like our food, water, just basic needs, some kind of income, you cannot do that without protecting the environment. And you cannot, and there will come, even if you are, and if you don't protect the environment, climate change as a whole, all these extreme events, like if your mangroves go, sea level rise, and the flooding events, they're going to become so visible and so devastating that you cannot do one without the other. So often we tend to focus on this trade-off. If we have to develop, the environment is going to get affected. And what this report says, we just don't have that luxury to do that. We cannot develop the same way that certain other countries developed, which is on the backs of, large-scale environmental degradation. That does not work. So I think this report is actually a wake-up call to policymakers to say, increasingly, if you don't protect your natural systems, your human systems are going to collapse. And it's going to happen faster and faster. So today you can get elected in spite of having maybe bad forest policies, but maybe 2 years down the line, 5 years down the line, everything will be happening simultaneously. In many places, it's already happening simultaneously. So I think it's just going to come a little later to our political leaders, but the science at least is very clear on this. We have to do these things simultaneously. So yeah, I think, and one of the ways I keep on talking about this, which is not in the IPCC, it is my personal opinion, but one of the ways we as citizens can exercise this is through our votes. That is the way you put political pressure. So I feel that all of us have a role to play in that, not to just always say, we are part of the elections as well. So I just like to add that, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then we go to another question from Yoki. I'm not sure if Yoki is here.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Your question about overfishing?
First of all, thank you very much for the sharing. And I would like to hear your opinion about the impact of overfishing on climate change, because we heard a lot about, we have to use electricity, we have to save electricity, or we should care more about deforestation, but not a lot of people talks about overfishing. And I would like to ask if has anything been done to actually overcome this problem, and what can we do as an individual person to actually, conquer this matter? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I am not a fisheries expert, but so I will not be able to give you an exact answer to this, but I would just like to say that I think you already know this, that climate change is going to impact it's already impacting marine ecosystems and fisheries in particular. So going to our Asia chapter, we had some excellent fisheries experts. And if you have particular questions, I'm really happy to link you to them, where we show that, just the availability of certain species is going to change rapidly under all the projections that we have. So that means what the implications of that is that implications are that we are in some ways going to perhaps have to change our diets, and there is going to be some implication of the kinds of fish that we see on our plates. What this means, and this is what we call loss and damage. So damage is this idea of maybe a particular road being damaged, some kind of infrastructure, but loss can be tangible, which is on incomes and things, but really intangible, which is that you might have very deep cultural connections to a particular kind of fish you eat, a particular recipe around it. And those kinds of losses of climate change are really difficult to quantify, but they are equally and sometimes even more important. So to say, I mean, yeah, I know I haven't answered your question, of course, fully, but just to say that this link between overconsumption of any kind, whether it is overfishing, whether it is overuse of water, for example, there is a clear link that says that we have to reduce demand to be able to deal with some of these limits and these risks that we are going to face. What it will look like in the fisheries sector, I am not so sure, and I can't give you a clear answer. But coming to your second part on individual action, I'm not sure if it was again around fisheries or in general. But I will take it as if it was general, because I think maybe other people would also be interested in hearing this, which is that one of the things we talk a lot about in the report is around climate literacy and climate education. So whether or not we are working on climate change, it is important that just people become more climate literate. By that I mean, make yourselves aware of the kinds of risks and impacts that are there, that are going to take place, and then really educate yourselves on the kinds of solutions that are out there, both at a personal level, but also at a community and at a political level. So I just like to add that as something, you know, one needs to think about bringing in climate education into schools, into higher education, but also at a very personal level, climate literacy really for you and me. Yeah, so I'll stop there. And that once you become climate literate is when then you can move from understanding it to actually acting on it.
Thank you very much for the answer. Thank you.
All right, I think we have a lot of questions on the floor, and I personally actually have some questions based on your slides. In one of your slides, you mentioned about you evaluate the connection between mitigation and adaptation, and that is something I think is quite important, especially now there's a net zero commitment for most of the country, and there's a lot of focus on mitigation. And I would like to know what is your observation? What might be the trade-off or synergies, or perhaps some negative impact from mitigation to adaptation, or vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm so glad you picked up on that, because we've been working so much in our silos of the adaptation people. They will do research on adaptation and implement adaptation. The mitigation folks do it separately, but any implementation, like a government has to do both these things simultaneously. And that's why I think it's very important to assess, is adaptation leading to mitigation or not, and vice versa. So as I said, of course, there are certain adaptation strategies that have the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or at least capture and then store carbon. Tree planting is a classic example of that, or even diversifying agricultural livelihoods to other things like forestry, agroforestry. So there are some examples in adaptation. As we'll see in Working Group 3, they have also done a similar assessment, and there are some mitigation strategies that can have adaptation benefits or negative, like trade-offs. One example that at least I see increasingly in India is, as a country, we have focused a lot on solar energy and just building out renewable energy through solar farms. And there are these large solar farms that are being set up in rural India. So it's very good on the mitigation side. We are able to transition our energy systems towards cleaner fuel. But those lands on which these solar farms are built are often rain-fed agriculture with smallholder farmers. and they are going to be displaced from these lands. So to what extent, how do we provide jobs for those people? And many people who are pro solar energy will say that they will get jobs on the solar farms. But if you visited any solar farm, you know that the jobs there are very different from what a farming livelihood would be. So it's a very different kind of job. It's again a loss of a whole way of life and connection to the land. So I feel we really need to think about some of these negative impacts of mitigation as well, which are not spoken about a lot, at least in my country right now. So we have maladaptation as an idea in Working Group 2, but I don't think we talk of mal-mitigation. I don't even know if it's a word or not. So maybe that's something to start thinking about. But equally, just to say, because I know, Wan, you work on urban green infrastructure, that's why I want to bring it up, which is to say that nature-based solutions in cities and in other areas also provide us some synergies across adaptation, mitigation, and SDGs. So they are one set of options that we can really explore and start deploying in a much larger way than we do right now. So mangrove restoration in coastal cities, tree planting, of course, there can be negatives of tree planting, but to do it in a way that is equitable, where people can derive multiple benefits from them. I think there are ways that we can adapt and mitigate simultaneously.
Yes, thank you. I think actually in Taiwan, we faced very similar questions because we are also using the farmland to create this solar farm. So I can see there's already some conflict. So it will be an interesting issue to follow up and to see the benefits and perhaps disadvantages on this issue. And we are about the time, but I have a final questions. I think there's one very important issue about adaptation globally is that most of the strategy or the focus has been on more developed countries, and however, there's a loss and damage perhaps more on the global south. And from your own research, what do you think? What we need to do to help the global south to develop the adaptation strategy, or what is the most imperative issue for the global south in general?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, because that question for me is deeply personal, because we know that the global south is most exposed to climate change. The global south has a long history of vulnerability, and then the global south has to now adapt the most. So it's almost like it's like three things hitting us simultaneously, and we've got large development challenges. So I think, of course, so there is a recognition about adaptation and the need to do it. One of the big problems at a global scale is that two big things. First of all, climate finance, the amount of money that is coming in for climate action is limited. It's not enough. But within that, most of it is going into mitigation and very little into adaptation. I think the broad numbers in this assessment report says that 92% of all climate finance goes for mitigation and 8% on adaptation. Now, from that 8%, you have to break it across all these countries. So you can imagine the finance gap that's there. But that is not my area of expertise, and there's still a lot of debate on the numbers of how much is it going to cost. So I'm not going to say how much is needed, but there is a gap there. But the bigger challenge, I think, for the Global South is really thinking about institutional capacity gaps. So that is something we can really work on, where how do our governments at various levels, national is only the first step, but subnational levels, even village council levels, how do we think about what I said in the beginning, compounding and cascading risks? And then how do we think about long-term adaptation? So not this reactive short-term, we'll make a 2-year, 5-year plan. I think you can't, given the enormity of the situation, I think we have to think of more long-term plans. And Bangladesh has been a very good example here. They have a Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100. So they're making 100-year plans to think about sea level rise and flooding, which I feel other countries, Southeast Asian countries, also expected to see a lot of flooding and already do see a lot of flooding, need to be making such plans similarly. So I think really institutional capacity, and by that I mean building that ability to make long-term decisions under a lot of uncertainty. It's not easy. You and I also won't be able to think about what are we going to do 10 years hence, 20 years hence, leave alone whatever 2050. So it is very difficult, but we have to build capacities for this longer term planning. I feel that's another key thing for the global south. And then finally, while of course agriculture and rural areas are going to be very important, continue to be important, we are moving towards an urban world. And so a lot of the battles of climate change, both on the risk side and the adaptation side, are going to be won and lost in cities. So we need many more people thinking about climate resilient development in our city governments. So urban planners, designers, junior engineers, water engineers, all these departments that we have, just climate literacy within them, I would say, is really a step that we need to think about.
Okay, thank you very much. It sounds like we still have a lot to do and the time is really short for us, unfortunately, but also an opportunity for everyone. So now I'd like to thank you our guest, Dr. Chandni Singh. She has actually an all-day teaching class, and thank you so much for the time for her to give us this very interesting and important talk. And also thank you all the participants today. I hope you enjoy our event, and we will have more to come in the future. So please follow us on Twitter and also Facebook. So perhaps Dolly want to have some words for our participants.
I also thanks for all the participants to join, and also thanks the wonderful talk to enhance our knowledge about the climate change and what we have to do. Yes, thank you very much, and I hope we can do something, and we all can follow our events to know more about what the knowledge scientists have to find, and we can do what to the global climate change. Thanks. So please follow our events in the future.
Okay. Also thanks to Future Earth Taipei and the Academia Sinica to make this event available. And thank you very much. And have
Thank
a
you
nice.
So much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And thanks.
Have a nice afternoon and an evening in Taiwan.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.